Are you ready for the word?
Yes, sir.
Let's go to Genesis 10. Genesis chapter 10. Three weeks ago, we went through the genealogies of Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as they are given in Genesis 10. And while going through that genealogy, I mentioned to you that there were two names that I wanted us to revisit later. One of them was Nimrod, whose name first shows up in Genesis 10:8, and then we're given some interesting information about that character in verses 8, 9, and 10. And 2 weeks ago, we spent time doing that, examining the biblical and the historical profile we're given about this guy named Nimrod. The other name was Peleg, who is mentioned in verse 25. And this morning, as promised, I want to revisit and talk about Peleg. And the reason being, there's an extraordinary thing that we're told about the days of Peleg. Let's read verse 25. And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. The name of one was Peleg, for in his days was the earth divided. Flip over, swipe over, whatever it is we do nowadays, to 1 Chronicles chapter 1 for a moment. To make that statement even more interesting, it's repeated. 1 Chronicles chapter 1 verse 19. And unto Eber were born two sons. The name of one was Peleg, because in his days the earth was divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. So the exact same information repeated for us in 1 Chronicles 1. So no matter where else we go in this study, there is one thing that we can know as an undeniable truth, and that is, before the days of Peleg, the earth was not divided. Because in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Before his days, it was not. Now, when I read that statement, the first thing I wanted to know was what's going on in the days of Peleg. If in his days the earth gets divided, what's going on in his days? If we can know what's going on in the days of Peleg, then it'll help us understand what is meant when it tells us that in his days the earth was divided. So to find out what was going on in the days of Peleg, I went to Genesis chapter 11. Because Genesis chapter 11 gives us a timeline from the flood. Now, you'll remember when we were, well, you might. It's been a long time ago, so I don't know if you'll remember or not, but that's the reason I brought you a chart and gave it to you this morning. When we were in Genesis 5, come on in. When we were in Genesis 5, we were given a timeline from Adam to the flood. And so I just gave that to you, a copy of that chart so you could look at it or keep it for later study. But we're given a timeline in Genesis 5 from Adam to the flood. And when you add that timeline up, you can discover that the earth was 1,656 years old when the flood came. Well, Genesis 11 establishes a timeline from the time the flood came until the time of Abram or Abraham. So Genesis 5 is from Adam to the flood, and Genesis 11 is from the flood to Abram or to Abraham. Let's go look at that in Genesis chapter 11. Genesis 11 verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad. When did he begat him? When was Arphaxad born?
Shem was 100 years old.
When Shem was 100 years old, and what's the other timeline?
2 years after.
Thank you, Bill. 2 years after the flood. So it's going to establish a timeline from the flood forward. So Arphaxad was born 2 years after the flood. Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years and begat sons and daughters. You understand the Bible wouldn't be giving us this information if it didn't matter. It's important. So we ought to pay attention to it. So Shem lived to be 600 years old. Verse 12, Arphaxad lived 35 years and begat Selah. And Arphaxad lived after he begat Selah 403 years and begat sons and daughters. So Arphaxad lived to be 438 years old. Selah lived 30 years, begat Eber, and Selah lived after he begat Eber 403 years and begat sons and daughters. So he lived to be 433. Eber lived 34 years, begat Peleg, and Eber lived after he begat Peleg 430 years and begat sons and daughters. So Eber lived to be 464 years old. Peleg lived 30 years and begat Reu. And Peleg lived after he begat Reu 209 years and begat sons and daughters. Peleg lived 239 years. And Reu lived 230 years, begat Serug. And Reu lived after he begat Serug 207 years and begat sons and daughters. So Reu, like his dad, only lived to be in the 200s. He lived to be 239 years. And Serug lived 30 years and begat Nahor. And Serug lived after he begat Nahor 200 years and begat sons and daughters. So he lived to be 230 years. Nahor lived 29 years, begat Terah. And Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years, begat sons and daughters. So Nahor lived to be 148 years old. Terah lived 70 years, begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, isn't that something? That of all, you live 148 years, and that's drastically less than anybody else in this genealogy lived. 148 years is a drastic drop from where we started just 6 or 8 generations before that. Back to verse 26. Terah lived 70 years, begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the daughter of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarah was barren, she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And they came unto Haran and dwelt there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So Terah lived to be 205 years old. So, read all of that to say this. From the days of Noah, the average age of death drops from the 900s to the 600s in one generation. And from the days of Noah's sons, it drops from the 600s to the 400s. So by the 3rd generation, it's gone from 900 to 400. 400 is still pretty good though, don't you think? That's half of what it previously was, but by today's average is 1/5 of that. You know, somebody reaches late 70s, 80s, and we tend to say, well, they lived a good long life. 400, 430, 460 was half of what it used to be. All right? So 100 years, and that's the reason I made that chart. If you have any questions about that chart, you can get with me. The front of it is made in a font that only Bill can read with his superpower. But the back of it, I broke it down, and I posted these on Facebook as well. But the back of it, I broke it down where we just went to Peleg so I could get the font a little larger and you could read it. But let me help you understand how I did the chart. It shows who begat who and how old they lived to be. And and the years past the flood that child was born, or Phatsad was born 2 years after the flood, Selah was born 37 years after the flood, Eber 67, Peleg 101, and Reu was born 131 years. So when you get to 100 to 130 years after the flood, the ages dropped from 600 down to 239 years. That's a pretty drastic drop. That means that over 500 years after the flood, men were still living a long, long, long time. So the flood did not do something to the ozone layer that caused men to live shorter. I've heard that taught. But if I'm looking and I'm seeing men live after the flood to 600 years, 463 years, it's not the ozone layer being destroyed that caused their ages to drop. Or that would have happened immediately, don't you think? There are men who are 464 years old and 600 years old after the flood. However, when you add all of this up and chart it out, you see that something drastic did happen in the days of Peleg that caused the age of men to drop immediately and drastically. It was not until his days that the age dropped. Not in the flood days, but in his days that the age began to drop. It went from 464 to 239 in one generation, and it would never rise above that again. Instead, it continued to drop generation after generation after generation. So, what happened in the days of Peleg? Well, we need to locate him by this information we're given. Locate him in the time that he's living. According to Genesis 11, he was born 101 years after the flood. Noah would have been 701 years old when he was born. So the lineage of Peleg is Noah, Shem, or Phatsad, Selah, Eber, then Peleg. When Brian was born, as an infant, I took him to see my great-grandfather, and we had a picture taken. It was with Brian, me, my dad, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather. 5 generations of Martins took it. And 2 or 3 years later, we went back and took the same picture. And by then, my great-grandfather was in his 90s. But it was a big deal to have 5 generations of Martins still alive. Well, Peleg could have taken the picture with his dad, his granddad, his great-granddad, his great-great-granddad, and his great-great-great-granddad. There would have been 5 generations of men older than him in the picture. There were only 3 men older than me in my picture. There would have been 5 men older than him in the picture. And when he was 239 years old, he could have went back and had taken the same picture again, and he could have added in the picture his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, his great-great-grandson, and his great-great-great-grandson. They're all still alive. Peleg would die 10 years before his great-great-great-grandfather Noah died. 10 years before his great-great-great-grandfather died. Now that's quite a lineage and quite a heritage. To see 10 generations beyond himself of children and grandchildren. When you chart this thing out and look at it, Abram was 58 years old before Noah died. You have to wonder the impact Noah might have had on Abraham's life. Abram was Noah's grandson with 9 great-greats in front of it. Great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson. And they're all alive at the same time. So the point is, Noah lived a long time. And so did Shem. Shem lived a long time. Shem was 390 years old when Abram was born. And he would live 210 years after Abram was born. Arphaxad lived a long time. He was 290 when Abram was born and would live another 148 years. Salah lived a long time. He was 255 when Abram was born and would live another 178 years. Eber was 225 years old when Abraham was born and would live another 239 years. But Peleg only lived to be 239. So he was 191 years old when Abram was born, and he would only live 48 years after Abram was born. Noah would live 10 more years beyond the life of Peleg. So something happened in his day that greatly shortened the lifespan of man. We're told what it was in this sentence. In his day, the earth was divided. So here's what we know. Let's back up and let's talk about what we know. A lot of numbers and figures and ages and stuff. But here's what we know. Noah lived to be 900. One generation after Noah lived to be 600. The second, third, and fourth generations only lived to be in their 400s. The fifth generation's age was reduced to the 200s. Keep that in mind now and go back to Genesis 10. And listen to this in verse 6. Because what we're trying to do is locate Peleg's time. Genesis 10 verse 6. And the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, and Phut, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Raamah, and Sabachta. And the sons of Raamah, Sheba, and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. Here are the generations of Ham. Ham, Cush, Nimrod. So Nimrod is the fourth generation from Noah. Okay? Peleg was the fifth generation from Noah. That means that in all likelihood, Nimrod was 30 to 50 years old when Peleg was born. So Nimrod and Peleg are living in the same day. Being 4 generations from Noah, Nimrod would have been between 60 to 70 years after the flood. That's not a long time. In other words, 60 to 70 years beyond the flood, you ought to know better than to do what Nimrod did. Right? You've already seen what the wrath of Yahweh will do. And yet, rather than submit to Yahweh, he chooses to fight against Yahweh. If the fourth generation had greater lifespans, and seeing that Nimrod was also a hybrid who possessed supernatural strength, supernatural power, supernatural knowledge, by the time he lived to be 200, 250 years, you've got to understand that this man is having a powerful negative impact upon the society that he lived in. Imagine the wickedness that can be done by a corrupt, satanic tyrant ruling over a territory for 250 years. 250 years is a long time for one man to exercise his tyranny and to promote and demand conformity to the abominations that he's pushing. 250 years, that's older than the U.S. And this man is exercising his tyranny, promoting his abominations for 250 years. Those are the days that Peleg grew up in. So, from the math and the genealogies, we can see that Nimrod and Peleg are contemporaries. Hope you haven't left yet. Now let's look again at what the Bible tells us about each one of those guys. Here's what the Bible tells us concerning Nimrod in Genesis chapter 11, verse 5. And Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. And Yahweh said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, mark that, go to. Let us go down and there confront their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So Yahweh scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because Yahweh did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did Yahweh scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So verse 7 says he confounded their language. But in verse 8, it says he scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth. How did he do that? Confounding the language is not a difficult thing. That's just a matter of the brain. Yahweh could easily confound their languages. But how do you scatter people over all the face of the earth? It's not like they're going to obey him, is it? They're rebels. So how did he scatter them abroad? Notice that it doesn't say that they all got into groups of common language and decided to go live somewhere else. You know, those speaking German decided, hey, let's go live in a land and call it Germany. Those speaking Mandarin didn't say, hey, let's all go to this land up here, we'll call it China. Those speaking English didn't all get together and go to a land and call it England. Okay? It does not say they gathered into groups and left. It says Yahweh scattered them. How do you do that? Well, that's where Peleg comes in. What did Genesis 10:25 and 1 Chronicles 1:19 tell us about the days of Peleg? In his days, what happened? The earth was divided. Not the people. It didn't say the people were divided. It said that in his days, the earth was divided. Does anyone have an eSword or a Hebrew dictionary available on your phone?
Yes.
Look up Peleg. Tell me what that name means.
Strong's definition is earthquake.
There you go. Peleg's name means earthquake. Read verse 25 again. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his day was the earth divided. Peleg means earthquake. It comes from a root word, Pelag, P-A-L-A-G, which is the word defined as divided at the end of the sentence. The root word Pelag means to split. The name of one was earthquake, for in his days was the earth split. And the event was so violent that it cut the lifespan of man in half from what it was 3 generations before that. When I was in school, they talked to us about continental drift. Any of you remember that? I had to look way back in my memory to remember that because it all sounded like a bunch of hogwash to me. But I do remember them teaching about continental drift. And continental drift is a scientific theory that the continents used to all be together, but they slowly drifted apart. And they theorized that to drift apart, how they have drifted apart, it had to take at least 335 million years to do it. Okay. And the reason they needed to come up with this theory is because they kept finding fossils of plants and animals on one continent whose DNA was identical to plants and animals on another continent. And these animals couldn't swim. So how did something identical in this continent, thousands of miles away, how did they also get over here on this continent? And so they said, well, the land must have at one time all been together 335 million years ago, and it drifted apart. This land mass, the large land mass where all the continents were together, they called it Pangea. P-A-N-G-E-A. Pan means all or entire. Gea means earth. So Pangea means the entire earth was together at one time. All right. Again, 335 million years ago, they began to drift apart, and now you have 7 continents. To which I say, no, 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 no. Here's what happened. Men decided to set up a one-world Luciferian government and to eliminate all knowledge of and all worship of Yahweh, and Yahweh put a stop to it. Every time you hear the heathen raging about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, remember Psalm 2. Go there for a minute. Because a heathen loved to rage. There's been that Nimrod spirit in the earth since Nimrod, of people who are determined to create a one-world government that is Luciferian in nature and eliminates all knowledge of Yahweh. But here's what Psalm 2 says. Why do the heathen rage? And the people imagine a vain thing. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against His anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. Does that make Yahweh want to chew his nails in fear and trembling and scared of what they're going to do? What does verse 4 say? He that sits in the heavens shall laugh. Yahweh shall have them in derision. That means Yahweh hears all of that and He laughs and mocks them. Then shall He speak unto them in His wrath and vex them in His sore displeasure. Sore displeasure means burning anger. When Yahweh, here's the point, when Yahweh confused the languages in Genesis 11, I don't think we put enough emotion into that when we read it. It wasn't a pleasant, playful thing of, watch it, I'm just going to kind of mess them up right here. And then they'll all just wander off. They're not going to know what happened. They'll all just wander off. That's not what happened. His anger was poured out on men who would rebel against Him in less than 200 years after the flood. They didn't learn. Look at Genesis 11 for a moment. In verse 3, they had said, go to. And in verse 4, they had said, go to. And in verse 7, Yahweh says, go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Go to, in the Hebrew, it means that you're determined to do a thing, and you're announcing that it's going to be done. You're demanding that a thing be done, or you're demanding that a thing be given. I think of it this way. It would be like saying, write this down. This is what's about to take place. So in verse 3 and in verse 4, they said, write it down. We're going to build a city and we're going to build a tower. And Yahweh said, no, you're not. Write this down. This is what's about to happen. So Yahweh, verse 8, scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Again, take time to look some of these words up. Go look up that phrase, scattered them abroad. That comes from one Hebrew word. Scattered them abroad comes from one Hebrew word, puts, P-U-T-S. That word means dash in pieces, break into pieces, shake it into pieces. Not scatter. It means to dash, break, and shake something into pieces. What did Peleg's name mean? What happened in his day? The earth was divided, or split, or dashed into pieces, broken into pieces, shaken into pieces. So Genesis 10:25 and Genesis 11:8 are both saying the same thing. That there was a violent outpouring of Yahweh's wrath that caused all of the land mass of the earth to split. The scientists are correct in that there was a continental divide, but it didn't drift away. It was forced away by the power of Yahweh. They didn't drift apart over millions of years. They were violently torn apart by Yahweh's anger to prevent a Luciferian one world government. I got another map here I'm going to show you. And a map of the earth. You'll see the Pangea on the left, where all of the continents are together. And if you look over on the right, it doesn't take any imagination at all to see how Africa could slide right up in there like a puzzle piece. Eurasia, all that just slides, and Antarctica coming up between South America and Africa, and all come back into. Isn't it interesting how they're shaped like puzzle pieces that would fit back together? They once were together, but they came apart. When? 335 years ago? No. In the days of Peleg, which would have been somewhere between 101 and 240 years after the flood. They are violently, the landmass is violently ripped apart by Yahweh. And those standing here and those standing there and those over here are separated by this violent action. Understand that it is the judgment of Yahweh and the power of Yahweh that brought about this division. They're torn apart by violent anger, and yet wicked men today are still seeking to create united nations. What God separated, they're trying to bring back together. We say the opposite of that in a wedding ceremony, don't we? What Yahweh has joined together, let no man tear asunder. Well, what Yahweh's torn asunder, let no man join back together. But we want united nations. They want a one world government in which they can set up a Luciferian religion identical to the one that Babylon had promoted. Still got all the same names, still got all the same celebrations, still got all the same holidays. It is identical to the one in Babylon. It should terrify the wicked when they read Genesis 6, when they read Genesis 11. It should terrify the wicked to see the lengths that Yahweh will go to ever allow this one world government to take root. It should terrify them. They wouldn't be meeting together trying to make it happen if they could comprehend that He is determined it will never take place. But at the same time, it should encourage the hearts of every servant of Yahweh to see the lengths that Yahweh will go to prevent that from ever taking place. Because when you watch the news, it looks like it's coming at us like a freight train and it's impossible to stop it. But Yahweh has demonstrated over and over and over again, He will not allow it. Even if He has to tear the continents apart by the power of His Word, He'll do whatever He has to do. He'll never allow Satan to rule the earth. He'll never allow Satan and his worshipers to have the earth. He who sits in the heavens will laugh. He'll hold them in derision. He'll mock at their foolish plans. And He'll smite them in His anger. I close simply with this. When science tries to explain something and they're always using terms like millions and billions of years, when science tries to explain something to you, if you want to know the truth about it, go see what Torah says. And it'll tell you exactly what happened, when it happened, and how it happened. That's a good place to say amen. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. As His name is put upon you, so shall He Himself bless you.